everyone, and welcome back to the Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to talk about bodies, and human bodies in particular. We will ask, what is at stake in how humans use their bodies, and why does it matter? So take a moment and notice what you're doing with your body as you're watching this video. Maybe you're sitting down on the couch or on the kitchen table. You might be taking notes or doodling. Maybe you're fidgeting with something. In a different time, we would all be in a large lecture hall. So take a second and remember what this lecture hall looks like. Making you all sit still in the lecture hall requires a lot of different things. The particular social roles that we perform in that context, you as students, me as teacher. It also requires a schedule, an institution, a degree program, the lights that dim when the lecture is about to start, maybe a slide projected. The chairs are all organized facing the podium. Usually you will be sitting down, I will be standing up. The way we move, even the way we stand still, like sitting down in a lecture hall, is always highly controlled and scripted, even when it feels very natural. This is a chart made in 1953 by an anthropologist called Gordon Hughes, showing different cultural ways that humans hold their bodies while at rest. But how do we learn to stand, sit, and lean in culturally appropriate and context-specific ways? This is the question that an older French anthropologist called Marcel Mauss asked in the 1930s. In an essay entitled Techniques of the Body and published in 1933, Mauss theorized that there are distinct ways in which humans in different societies know how to use their bodies. For Mauss, this was to be understood at the same time as a biological, a sociological, and a physiological phenomena. Mauss called this a technique of the body. This is just the way we move, the actions or sets of actions that people perform, like sitting, crawling, dancing, jumping, toothbrushing, swimming, sleeping, throwing, lifting. All of these techniques of the body, Mauss theorized, are learned and acquired in culturally specific ways. And these change over time, carrying within them particular historical legacies. These culturally specific techniques of the bodies are also co-produced with accents of sex and gender, age, social status, power, and so forth. So my first question for you today is to think about a technique of the body, a simple activity that you do every day with your body, and think about how that activity and the way you do it in particular reflects your own gender, social class, and cultural positioning. Some techniques of the body also involve tools. Think about the way you eat, for example. Can you eat with your hands? Can you spin spaghetti on a fork? Can you eat with chopsticks? These are not just technical skills, Mauss writes. These are precise cultural norms that determine if the way you hold the fork, how you pass food to others, is contextually appropriate or rude. And these norms tell us as much about your social status, your age, and the context in which you're eating. Think about different ways in which you walk as another example, and how they change depending on the activity. How do you walk at a funeral, a rally, on a romantic stroll, pub crawling, in a religious procession, on a mountain walk, if you are a shepherd, if you are a queen, if you are a tour guide? So according to Mauss, we need to think about techniques of the bodies in ways that are at the same time physical, enabled by bodies that are organisms, sociological, meaning bodies that are socialized and that communicate collective meaning, and thirdly, psychological, that is about the theory of mind, the perception, the experience of moving a body and what it means. So if there are many different ways of walking, Mauss writes, none of them is just natural. And people have an immense capacity for learning specific ways of walking and for teaching it to others. So as part of this unit, you will read two ethnographies that help us understand the human bodies from a broader anthropological perspective. The first is an ethnography of professional fighters in Chicago, and it centers on the idea of bodily labor. Bodily labor is the work that transforms body through regulated activities and that produces value. The second is an ethnographic study of a community of sugarcane workers and service wage workers in the northeast of Brazil focusing on local understandings of sickness and disease. So let us now travel to Chicago's South Side, following anthropologist Loic Wakhan as he goes to the boxing gym where he has been training and also conducting research. Hear how Wakhan writes about the gym. Walk into a boxing gym and you cannot but be struck by the sight and sounds of bodies everywhere and enraptured by the strange, ballet-like spectacle that they offer. Gliding across the ring, colliding and clinching, feet squealing on the thick blue mat, or moving back and forth in measured steps in front of a mirror. Shadow boxing in pursuit of an invisible opponent, circling heavy bags hung from the ceiling, punching speed bags as if in imitation of a machine gun, or rhythmically skipping rope and folding in half for endless series of sit-ups, all in unison. The washboard abdominals, chiseled torsos and cut-up quadriceps, sculptured backs, tights behind and thighs, and the grimacing faces glistening with sweat. So many visible indices of the bodily labor that makes up the trade of the pugilist. Bodily labor, as Wakhan theorizes it, is the work of training in a gym and at home, and also the constant practices of control and restraint that the boxers have to implement, restraint in their diet, in their sleep, and in their relationships. The idea is for the fighter's body to produce more value in the form of championship titles, matches won, social recognition, and also an income. But there is a paradox. Over time, a fighter's body loses the capacity to recover from training and also from fighting injuries. A fighter then will have to manage his body over the course of his career, striking a balance between achieving fighting proficiency and avoiding or at last delaying bodily depletion. And this is what Loic Wakhan calls bodily capital. As they transform their bodily work into the social and economic forms of value, fighters can grow their bodily capital, but they can also lose it. And Wakhan, over the course of his research in this gym, finds that most fighters enjoy the physical extortion, despite the monotony of the workouts. Fighters understand that their physical damage, the risk, their bodily decay, even the risk of death in a match are just part of the order of things, are normal things about what it means to be a professional fighter. And they really believe that they can minimize this damage through careful training and through a particular and meticulous care of the body. And in this cultural world of fighters, this is an unquestioned belief. So to describe this taken for granted belief, this taken for granted truth, Wakhan uses the word doxa, which he's taking from the work of a French sociologist called Pierre Bourdieu, who'd been writing in the 1980s. So let me pause for a second and ask you, what is an assumption about the world that you take for granted in your everyday life that you never really stop to question? Let me take you on a little detour to the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and we're going to return to his theorization of class just in a few weeks from now. Pierre Bourdieu was really interested in how power and social structures shape the subjective experience of an individual and how they're reproduced. How do people know what to do, especially in situations that are not structured by formal rules? And how do people improvise within these invisible structures that shape what they think is possible? Bourdieu's work was a response to more symbolic approaches in anthropology. So instead of focusing on the cultural meanings of symbols, Bourdieu really wanted to know how people do things in practice with their bodies. And he called this approach a theory of practice. Okay, so central to Bourdieu's theory of practice is the idea of the habitus. The habitus shapes how you do a thing, but also the social structures and the power relations that create the conditions and the limits for how you do it. So let me quote from Bourdieu's own writing. The habitus is an endless capacity to engender thoughts, perceptions, expressions, actions, limited by historically and socially situated conditions of production. It provides a freedom that is neither boundless creativity nor mechanical reproduction. So I would like you to spend a few minutes with this. It's pretty abstract, but try to unpack it. What do you think it means? And now, can you think of concrete examples of the habitus in the context of this particular theorization? So the main point about the habitus is that it feels natural, it feels logic, and it gives people a sense of freedom in what they do, in how they act. It's deeply embodied in your sense of who you are, but it is structured nevertheless. So for example, think about something you do routinely that makes you feel exceedingly free. And now think about how that action, that expression of freedom is actually constrained by other things, or maybe how you think it is constrained by other things. What are the bounds of that freedom? Maybe that those constraints are the space in which you are, maybe a certain expectation for how you are to behave and act, maybe your own understanding of your class position, your life trajectory, a gender-appropriate way of moving or being, the power relations that affect your life. And we're going to return to Bourdieu later on in this course. But now, let us follow a different anthropologist called Nancy Scheper Hughes in the neighborhood of a poor rural town in the northeast of Brazil. It's the 1980s, and initially a much younger Scheper Hughes had gone there to work as a public health worker, and she later returned as an anthropology PhD student and as a researcher. At the time of her first visit, this settlement was characterized by a 40% infant mortality rate. This is huge. So in this town, men typically cut sugarcane in the fields, and women were largely employed as domestic workers for the local landowners. And everyone was very poor and everyone was very hungry all the time. And Scheper Hughes noticed that men and women and children all experienced a kind of suffering in their bodies, which they all called nervoso. And nervoso is a Brazilian word, and it's also a local term that everyone just used to describe how they were feeling. And she paid attention to it and tried to understand what were the things that people experienced that they understood as being under the category of nervoso. And being nervoso, as it turns out, meant things as different as experiencing headaches, shaking legs, even paralysis, rapid breathing, stomach pains, vomiting, dizziness, madness, buzzing in the ears, seizures, vision darkness, an inability to sleep, a kind of shaking. So people use the term nervoso to talk about such different but interconnected problems. It's a little similar to how middle-class people in America talk about being stressed. So it was obvious to Scheper Hughes that nervoso was about a shared experience of hunger, of food precarity, and insecurity. But whenever Scheper Hughes had this conversation with her interlocutors and pointed it out, they repeatedly denied the direct connection to their hunger, poverty, and marginalization. They disagreed with her interpretation. Instead, they would often talk about the various medicines and pills that they got from the municipality clinic. Various antibiotics, sleeping pills, painkillers. Mothers who were severely malnourished and unable to breastfeed their babies would go to the clinic and receive vitamins, food supplements, and men working in the sugarcane field often experienced stomach pain and tiredness, even a paralysis on their legs, and had to quit these agricultural jobs. They would go to the town clinic and they would receive medicines so that they could continue working in other capacities. So according to Scheper Hughes, the entire community framed their own structural hunger and exploitation as a kind of a bodily weakness. So this means that in a way, they depoliticized hunger and poverty, and they did that unconsciously, without being aware. So hunger and poverty are obviously social problems. They're about how work is organized, how wealth and resources and lands and services and goods are distributed. But nervoso indicated a medical problem and one that was addressed at the level of the individual body. So in this sense, nervoso, according to Scheper Hughes, is an embodiment of a particular kind of exploitation and inequality. It's embodied because it's about how people inhabit and experience their bodies in that context. And it's collective because this was a shared frame for people to talk about the experiences of structural poverty and marginalization, and they talk about them by talking about how their bodies felt. However, in doing so, they also naturalized poverty to some extent, meaning the idiom of Nervoso made it seem as if these conditions were really about people's individual flaws, their weaknesses, their illnesses, things that could be treated with vitamins and supplements and painkillers, and not about a wider societal problem. So Shepard Hughes writes about it as, quote, a collective and embodied response to the nervous political system. And I want to end on this quote, and I would like you to stop for a second and consider this formulation and try to identify an example of a different collective and embodied response to a political system in your own life. This is all for today. Thank you for joining me, and I'll see you all very soon.